All right, so my name is Jason Grinblat. I'm the co-founder of Freehold Games along with Brian Bucklew. And today I want to tell you about using procedural generation to tell collaborative stories with your players. And just to reiterate some of our backgrounds, so most recently we released a roguelike called Sproggiwood. Before that we worked on a game called Caves of Qud, which was kind of more of a traditional hardcore roguelike. So I'd like to show you a video of some Let's Players playing Caves of Qud. Before I do that, though, for those of you who aren't familiar with Caves of Qud, I want to tell you a little bit about it. So it's a far future open world science fantasy roguelike with mutant animals and humans and robots whose purpose has been long forgotten. And it's far enough after the apocalypse, whatever it was, that technology has been imbued with this sort of mysticism akin to magic. It was inspired by a pen and paper role-playing game, a derivative of Dungeons and Dragons called Gamma World, which I'll talk about a little later. Also classic roguelike Adam and its open world, and the mutable and destructible environments of Dwarf Fortress. So it's sort of hard to summarize the gameplay of Caves of Qud because there's a lot you can do. But one of our players had started to enumerate a list of some of the things that you can do in Caves of Qud, and some of them I thought were pretty relevant, so I thought I'd share some of those with you. So you can get into a gunfight with a hyena monster and accidentally anger a herd of majestic hulking demon horses with your crossfire. You can fly into the air like a beautiful eagle and then sword fight a giant dragonfly. You can mind control a two-headed boar and make it wear chainmail and kill your enemies. And you can encounter a legendary plant with an intimidating skull mask and the ability to throw fiery death from its hands. Okay, so with that in mind, this is going to be a video of some Let's Players streaming Caves of Qud together.
So I'm in a bad situation right now.
Yeah.
Okay, you're kind of surrounded.
Yep.
No. Oh yeah, you have to get to that hallway. You have to get to that hallway.
That purple one looks.
Yeah, what's up with that purple?
cool,
What's up with that purple
He
one?
is a probably a
up with that
warlord.
purple?
Oh, he is a name dude.
Ugo.
The
I
callous
despise
snapjaw tot eater.
Oh, he admired antelopes. He's admired by antelopes for sharing freshwater. Oh, he shares freshwater with his antelopes.
Oh,
The mollusks
Hated.
hate him though.
for casting doubt on their beliefs. Dang.
They believe. Yeah. Man.
It's really a feud between the antelopes and the mollusks.
this is
Right.
it.
With the,
So I really love that clip. In particular, I love how they're able to just take this sort of procedural bit of backstory that's attached to this unique monster and invent just this little narrative about how the mollusks are at war with the antelopes and this snapjaw is caught in the middle. So that's sort of the collaborative storytelling that I'm talking about, and I'll tell you more about that. So today, I'm going to describe what we're going to do. So let's define and motivate collaborative storytelling and discuss the role of procedural generation. We're going to take a look at collaborative storytelling in Fiasco, which is a pen and paper role-playing game, a GM-less game. We'll talk about that a little bit. And we're going to examine the themes of Caves of Qud and Gamma World, which was its inspiration, and how we embedded those themes into our procedural content to allow for that type of storytelling. Okay, so collaborative storytelling, what is it? So in 2008, Will Wright, creator of SimCity, he was giving a speech to, I think, a school of design, and he said, "Players tell stories. We designers provide a platform for player expression." So I think this is a really good encapsulation of one philosophy of game design. I don't think it's the only philosophy of game design. I think there's another philosophy that is sort of takes the approach of the more traditional path of narrative where the designer, the flow of the narrative comes like from the writer to the reader or from the designer to the player, and it's consumed in a more traditional way. But Will Wright's talking about like a pretty specific type of game philosophy where you're enabling players to create their own stories. So that's sort of a spectrum, I think, but I think it's useful to draw that distinction between a developer story, which is a narrative crafted by a developer that's going to be consumed by a player, and a player story, which is a narrative that's sort of crafted by the player in order to make sense of their experience playing the game. So roguelikes have a long tradition of player stories, and we could think about like yet another stupid death stories, for example. So like if this is me and I'm playing Caves of Qud, my experience playing Caves of Qud, in particular my experience dying while playing Caves of Qud, let's say if I was eaten by a mollusk, is different than your experience playing Caves of Qud, and in particular your experience dying while playing Caves of Qud. What's like, just for argument's sake, let's say you spontaneously combusted. Those are both things, yes, that could happen in Caves of Qud, definitely. So these are different, and clearly these are different experiences, and we could ask why. Why is there this tradition of player stories? Why is it interesting that it exists? Like, why do we want to share player stories at all? And I think it would surprise no one in this room to learn that I think a big part of this is procedural generation, right? Because procedural generation provides the variety of game experience that makes my experience different than yours, and thus there's some reason for me to want to relay my experience to you or to you to me. So that's all well and good. But what's sort of interesting to me also is that for a given game, some of the elements of those different player stories are actually similar. There's a similar thread among those stories. And we could think of, like, for yet another stupid death stories, a shared element might be like the brutality of the deaths in one game or the comedy of the deaths in another game. And what those common threads are going to be different from game to game, but the point is that while there are different player stories being told and shared in this community, they're similar in some way. So this is sort of interesting because basically we can use that common thread as designers. We can introduce things like theme and tone and mood into our procedural content, both when we decide what to procedurally generate and then when we're actually crafting our static units that are going to be combined procedurally to sort of embed that common thread into the player stories that are created when people play our games. And that's really what I mean when I say collaborative storytelling. So we're collaborating with our players because we're sort of drawing the outline of the space within which their stories can take place. So this is cool because for some of us who are interested in designing roguelikes, we also have our own ideas and themes that we want to explore in our roguelikes, and maybe that we want our players to explore. So this is really good news. Excellent. So I want to show you an example of collaborative role-playing. So my definition of collaborative role-playing or collaborative storytelling is actually sort of an extension of an existing definition. So there's something called collaborative role-playing in like the pen and paper world, which generally refers to games that don't have game masters. So you're probably at some level, everyone somewhat familiar with Dungeons and Dragons. There's a dungeon master. He sort of dictates the story to a group of players. There's also a subset of games that don't have that GM component. They basically rely on the players all together to collaborate to create this, to tell the story and to have it unfold together. And I think there's a sort of interesting parallel here because like collaborative role-playing systems, video games don't have that sort of human narrator who's there to insert or dictate the themes that they might want to insert or dictate. It sort of has to be done through the players, through the collaborators, but also through the system. So I think it's kind of provides some motivation to looking at one of these systems. So Fiasco is one of these systems. It came out fairly recently, just a few years ago. It is in particular is designed to simulate the caper gone wrong subgenre of film. And if you're familiar with Fargo or Big Lebowski or No Country for Old Men, the Coen brothers movies, in particular the sort of themes that these movies explore. And those themes, like when we start to think about them, those movies have very common themes. There are things like human stupidity, overreaching ambition. Often it's people, typically men, in these situations where they get way over their head and they sort of don't understand the complex social systems they're in. So remember those themes for a minute. We're going to get back to that. But I want to talk a little bit about Fiasco's actual game rules because I think it's sort of informative for how they use a simple system to embed themes, these sorts of themes into their player stories. So basically how you play Fiasco is like you roll a giant pool of d6 dice, and then there are a bunch of tables that include plot elements. And these are things like relationships, settings for scenes, objects that might appear in the scene. And you go around the table and each player places a d6 with the number that matches to one of these elements. They choose an element. And once you're out of dice, basically you have your scene set up that you then role play. So you role play a few scenes, and then there's something called the tilt, which is an unexpected event that shakes up the story. And how you set up the tilt is in the same way. You roll a pool of d6, you assign the numbers to some of these unexpected events like tragedy, death out of the blue, paranoia, a stranger arrives to settle a score, and then you set up the tilt, and then you play out what's called Act 2, which is the remainder of the game, the remainder of the scenes. So basically, to sum up, players roll dice to randomly combine static elements and produce diverse gameplay experiences. Does this process sound familiar? It's procedural generation, right? Albeit in a pen and paper form. So what's interesting here is that some of the relationships, we could see like relationships like con man and Mark, or a relationship like corrupt official and local big shot. When we think about those relationships, and then we think about a tilt element like someone develops a conscience, we know that something is sort of bound to go wrong, that the system's sort of setting us up for tragedy, and for a particular type of tragedy that is exploring some of the themes here that we talked about when we looked at those Coen Brothers slides. So while the details differ, while the con man and the Mark, one of who develops a conscience, might play out differently than the the corrupt official, the local big shot, the details might differ. We see how what shared thread is shared among those stories that will ultimately play out. And indeed, Fiasco bills itself as a game of powerful ambition and poor impulse control. And the procedural elements themselves were designed to enable stories with precisely those themes. They're not just kind of randomly crafted. The system is using these very, very specifically crafted elements to enable stories with this theme. So with that in mind, going to the development of Caves of Qud and its inspiration, which was Gamma World, I really want to look at what some of the themes of both Caves of Qud and Gamma World are, and then I'll show you sort of how we embedded those into our procedural content. So if you haven't heard of Gamma World, it's awesome. It was the primary inspiration for Caves of Qud. It is, like I said, it came out in the 70s. It's a post-apocalyptic role-playing setting that takes place after a nuclear fallout, and it has mutants and robots and all sort of awesome things. One thing about it is that the character creation system is really awesome, and again evokes this pen and paper procedural generation. So the way that you create a mutant character is essentially you pick a base template, human, animal, or plant, and then you add mutations by rolling from this giant table of mutations. And the interesting thing about this is that you actually have a lot less control over the direction of your character than you do in a traditional pen and paper role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons. You roll randomly from these mutations, you roll some amount of them, 5 or 6, and then that's the character you get. And that constraint that's put on you that comes from this random character generation really triggers some interesting, creative role-playing, because you have to sort of think, well, what would it be like to role-play a two-headed tortoise, or what would it be like to role-play a telepathic pelican? You have to put yourself in that position and try to envision, well, what does a pelican who's really smart and telepathic care about? Fish, this probably plays a big role. So let's see here. When we started to develop Caves of Qud, we had this intuition that, wow, Gamma World would make a really great roguelike. It just has these procedural elements, the procedural generation of the characters. We hadn't really, there weren't many sci-fi roguelikes out at the time, so we really had this intuition that it would translate well to the roguelike space. So when we start to think about really hard about what are the actual themes at work in Gamma World, and what are the actual themes at work that we want to incorporate into Caves of Qud, there's, some things come to mind, like the arc of our relationship with technology, how it's interesting how, we're kind of riding that arc upward right now, but Gamma World sort of envisions a world where that floor has been cut from under you, and the humanity's relationship with technology is much different. It's this one of, like I said earlier, kind of akin to relationship with magic that you just don't really understand. There's the immensity of nature, the limited role of humans. human characters play a much smaller role in the Gamma world than they do in most role-playing systems. A vast minority of the characters are human, and an even smaller minority are actually what we call pure strain human, or in Caves of Qud, true men that are actually unaffected by this mutagenic whatever that's in the ether. And then in particular, one thing that really interested us was our relationship with our morphology. And this kind of gets back to that pelican and the two-headed tortoise examples, that when we're thinking about what happens when some of these animals or even plants are sort of artificially uplifted to human level intelligence, we sort of try to imagine what they would be like, what they would act like, what their motivations would be. And I think a lot of that comes from our anthropomorphizing of those creatures, and like assigning our own values to them, but sort of tweaking them to based on our understanding of what those creatures are like, and often what their biologies dictate about them. So the pelican it was called out that fish, would probably play a big role in the life of a sentient pelican. So the question now then would be, how do we enable player stories that explore the theme of our relationship with our morphology? So like Gamma World, we decided to generate unique NPCs by choosing a base class, something like human or boar or plant, and then procedurally generating things like its equipment and procedurally generating its mutations. So we put a lot of attention, a lot of procedural attention in that area, because this was a theme that was important to us. And the result, well, do you remember this? Encounter a legendary plant with an intimidating skull mask and the ability to throw fiery death from its hands. Meet Otsum. He's the most metal plant ever. He's wearing a skull mask. He has ghostly flames emanating from his body. It's a seed-spitting plant. So this is a unique monster that was generated procedurally from Caves of Qud. It had a base plant stock. It had procedurally generated equipment. In this case, it was a helmet. It had a procedurally generated mutation, ghostly flames. And right away, we sort of see this and we react to this. We see this legendary plant, the seed-spitting vine. It's wearing this crazy metal, skull. It has flames emanating from it. We start to think about well, this is a pretty badass plant. What's it doing? Is it a warlord? Is it, what is a plant warlord doing? Does it try to conquer more fertile land, to grow more? These are questions that clearly are influenced by our anthropomorphizing of a seed-spitting vine, but they're sort of in the vein of that theme of our relationship with our morphology and how we kind of assign meaning to all of these procedural elements that we're seeing. So how do we go further? How do we enable more player stories? One thing we decided to do was, for each NPC, we generate backstories about that NPC's relationship with the various factions in Qud. And those backstories take the template of feeling by faction for a reason. So we see Ugo again from the video. Ugo is loved by Snapjaws because those are his people. He's hated by mollusks for casting doubt on their beliefs. He's admired by antelopes for sharing fresh water with them. And we see that the Let's Players in that video sort of, caught on to that and generated this story about this war between the antelopes and the mollusk. Ugo's caught in the middle. If we look at the mollusk and we see that Ugo's hated for casting doubt on their beliefs, we start to ask questions like, well, what does a mollusk believe? And what does a mollusk believe so strongly that it gets angry when doubt is cast on that belief? I like that the antelopes, the antelopes liked him because he shared fresh water with them, and I think they were like a herd animals. They come up and he shared fresh water with all of them. It's very, very touching. One thing I want to note here is that all these backstories are actually tied to a robust faction system that tracks relationships between different factions and individual monsters and factions in the player. And in fact, if Ugo were to actually encounter a mollusk in Caves of Qud, if they were to be randomly generated on the same screen, then the faction, that little piece of faction backstory would influence the mollusk's behavior. The mollusk would know to attack Ugo, and then all hell would break loose. And it would be pretty bad. So what sort of happened here was that Stream Friends, who's the group of streamers from the video I showed you, they told a story about Ugo, exploring a theme posed by Freehold Games. And this is the level of collaboration that I'm talking about when I say collaborative storytelling, sort of a collaboration between the player and the writer, developer, designer of the game who's sort of embedding their themes into the player's stories. So if you want to enable thematic player stories, my suggestions to you would be to, well, first identify what your themes are. And I think this is actually quite difficult. I think we have a lot of intuitions about what would make cool or compelling content, and I won't lie to any of you and say that we had all of this figured out when we were developing Caves of Qud. That's very much not the case. We were guided mostly by our intuitions at first, and we would think of something that we thought would map well from Gamma World to Caves of Qud, and just be like, oh, that would be really cool if that were in our game. But I would suggest spending some time trying to unpack your intuitions around what really makes those ideas compelling. I would also suggest so you decide where to use your procedural pen. What I mean by this is when you think of all the things that you are designing your game, where do you want to put your procedural attention? You only have so much capital, so to speak, when you're actually going through and making content. So my suggestion would be to choose types of content that lend thematic dimensionality to your gameplay. So for us, we're exploring this theme of morphology and crazy mutant plants and animals. It made sense for us to put a lot of attention on the different ways in which mutant plants and animals could be, there could be variety among them. And then decide what to draw with your procedural pen. This is kind of like this goofy metaphor here. And what I mean by that is when you're actually at the level of crafting your individual static units, really think about things that would sort of lead the player on the right tack to maybe produce the type of stories that you're interested in or that you're interested in them experiencing. And I would go back to Fiasco here and say, they picked very specific relationships like con man and Mark, or corrupt official and whatever it was, crime boss. They could have picked from among all the relationships that humans have, but those in particular, sort of, we think of con man and Mark, there's some amount of implicit ambition there. We think of corrupt official and crime boss. There's again like that element of ambition. So they picked very specific static units that were thematic and that were going to enable these thematic player stories. And then I think that's it. Are there any questions? Yes. Okay, so the question was, do the mollusks have beliefs, right? Do the mollusks, is there some systematic representations of those beliefs, or is that sort of, at that level, is it just sort of, backstory that is attached there, and then there's no actual like gamer interpretation of that? So yeah, that currently in the current form of the game, that's the level where we sort of cut out, we don't really embed any logic behind the reasons of those beliefs. Yeah, so it's Mad Libby, right. Yeah, and so, you could do all sorts of things with that. So it is at the level that, that sort of the feeling aspect of it, whether they hate you or admire you or, dislike you, that is all reflected in their relative faction, how the faction feels about you. We call that reputation and kind of what your mollusk reputation is. But yeah, when we get to the reason, this is actually a somewhat new system in Caves of Qud. When we get to the reason, there's no, if they love you, if they hate you because you casted out on their beliefs, there's no difference than if they hate you because you raided their village, for example. But that's something we kind of want to play around with potentially. Yes? Yeah, so the comment was that essentially that if you want to limit your procedural content, like what your procedural algorithms are drawing from these static units, so that the space isn't so large that there's no similarity between these player stories. And I think that's absolutely right. I think in the Fiasco example, again, like the fact that they picked relationships where there was some amount of ambition sort of implicit to those relationships is very important. And if you just try to model every human relationship, you'd have this cool giant procedural system, which sometimes we're drawn to, but it would lose some of the thematic density. Yes? Yeah, that's good. Thank you because I am sort of ignorant of that. So yeah, and the comment was that this is the distinction between developer story and player story is something that's very alive in the game industry. There's this distinction that with the terminology they use is narrative versus ludonarrative. So I think that's all very interesting, and I think it really is like a spectrum, because even in the most traditional story where you're reading a book, say, there's just no interactive element, you're still bringing a lot, just by virtue of your interpretation of the story, you're bringing your own past and just your understanding of concepts that are in the story. So there's some amount of player story, in that case reader story, that's happening just implicitly. So it's not like just two poles. I think there's something in between, and that space, is interesting to us as game designers generally. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Sure.